Released video evidence in a teen athlete murder case. Karmelo Anthony was convicted and sentenced to 35 years for the fatal stabbing of another teen, Austin Metcalf, during a Texas high school track meet last year. A judge released images of the murder weapon, video of the stabbing and aftermath, along with emotional 911 calls from the victim's brother. In one video, you actually hear Anthony admitting to that stabbing.
It's the alleged suspect.
I'm not alleged. I did it.
Okay. Anthony's attorneys claim he stabbed Metcalf in self-defense. They have filed a notice to appeal his conviction.
The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Months of testimony, hours of surveillance footage, forensic analysis, eyewitness accounts, and legal arguments had led to this single moment. At the center of it all was one question that had divided public opinion from the day the case first made headlines. Was this an act of lawful self-defense, or was it an unjustified killing? The jury had listened to every witness. They had examined every piece of evidence placed before them, and after carefully weighing the facts presented during the trial, they rejected the claim of self-defense. For many watching, the verdict seemed inevitable. For others, it came as a shock. Online debates had transformed the case into something much larger than a single courtroom proceeding. Supporters and critics argued over every newly released document, every court filing, and every video clip that surfaced. But inside the courtroom, opinions from social media carried no legal weight. Only the evidence mattered. What exactly convinced 12 jurors that the legal standard for self-defense had not been met? Which moments during the investigation and trial proved most damaging to the defense? And how did prosecutors gradually dismantle an argument that had dominated headlines for months? Those answers begin long before the jury entered the deliberation room. To understand why the self-defense claim ultimately failed, it's necessary to go back to the beginning, to the people involved, the circumstances leading up to the fatal encounter, and the sequence of events that prosecutors argued painted a very different picture than the one initially presented. This case quickly became one of the most closely watched criminal trials in recent memory, drawing national attention not only because of the tragic loss of life, but also because it raised difficult questions about fear, perception, accountability, and the limits of self-defense under the law. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, each newly uncovered detail either strengthened or weakened competing narratives until a much clearer picture began to emerge. Throughout this documentary, we'll separate verified courtroom evidence from online speculation, relying on testimony, publicly available court records, and evidence introduced during the trial. Where facts remain disputed, we'll clearly identify them as such rather than presenting assumption as certainty. Because in cases like this, the smallest detail can change everything. And sometimes, what a jury ultimately rejects is just as important as what it chooses to believe. Before we examine the key moments that led jurors to reject the self-defense claim, we first need to understand who the people at the center of this tragedy were, and how an ordinary day ended in a decision that would forever alter countless lives. If you appreciate carefully researched true crime documentaries that focus on verified evidence rather than speculation, consider subscribing to Cold Case Files, leaving a like, and turning on notifications so you don't miss future investigations. Now, let's go back to where this story truly begins. Before the case reached a courtroom, it began with a confrontation that would forever change two families. Prosecutors argued that understanding the events leading up to the fatal encounter was essential to evaluating the later claim of self-defense. Investigators reconstructed the timeline using witness testimony, surveillance footage, physical evidence, and digital records presented during the trial. Rather than viewing the incident as an isolated moment, they encouraged jurors to consider the complete sequence of events. The prosecution's case centered on whether the defendant reasonably believed deadly force was immediately necessary under the law. That question depended not only on the final seconds of the encounter, but also on everything that happened beforehand. As more evidence emerged, the narrative became increasingly complex. Some accounts aligned, while others conflicted. Witness recollections varied, forensic findings added new context, and each new detail became another piece of a puzzle the jury would eventually have to assemble. Long before closing arguments, both sides understood that the case would likely be decided by how jurors interpreted these key moments, not by emotion, online opinion, or public debate, but by the evidence admitted in court. If you're enjoying this evidence-based breakdown, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Files, and turn on notifications so you never miss future true crime investigations. Next, we'll examine the first critical moments prosecutors argued, began to undermine the self-defense claim, and ultimately influenced the jury's decision. As investigators continued piecing together the timeline, the focus shifted from what happened after the incident to what occurred in the moments leading up to it. During the trial, prosecutors emphasized that a successful self-defense claim depends on more than simply asserting fear. Under the law, jurors had to determine whether the use of deadly force was both reasonable and immediately necessary based on the evidence presented. To answer that question, the jury carefully examined surveillance footage, witness testimony, forensic findings, and digital evidence introduced during the proceedings. Rather than relying on any single piece of evidence, prosecutors encouraged jurors to evaluate how each element fit into the broader sequence of events. The defense argued that the defendant perceived an imminent threat. Prosecutors, however, challenged that interpretation, pointing to evidence they contended was inconsistent with a lawful claim of self-defense. Throughout the trial, experts explained forensic findings while eyewitnesses described what they observed, allowing jurors to compare those accounts against the physical evidence. The judge repeatedly instructed the jury that attorneys' arguments were not evidence. Their responsibility was to assess the credibility of witnesses, weigh the exhibits admitted during trial, and apply the law exactly as instructed. By the end of this stage of the proceedings, prosecutors believed they had laid the foundation for their case. Whether the jury agreed would ultimately depend on how they interpreted the evidence as a whole, a process that would shape every decision still to come. The trial reached a pivotal stage as the prosecution walked jurors through what it described as the decisive moments of the encounter. Rather than asking the jury to focus on a single instant, prosecutors reconstructed the entire sequence using evidence presented in court, arguing that each event had to be viewed in context. Jurors reviewed surveillance footage frame by frame, listened to eyewitness testimony, and examined forensic evidence. Prosecutors argued that the combined evidence did not support the legal requirements for self-defense, while the defense maintained that the defendant believed deadly force was necessary to protect against an imminent threat. Throughout the proceedings, attorneys challenged each other's interpretations of the evidence. Witnesses were cross-examined, timelines were scrutinized, and experts explained how physical evidence aligned, or failed to align, with competing accounts. The jury was instructed to judge the credibility of every witness and to base its conclusions solely on the evidence admitted during trial. As deliberations approached, the central question remained unchanged. Had the prosecution proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant's actions were not legally justified, or did the evidence leave room for a reasonable belief that self-defense applied? The answer would not be found in public opinion or online debate. It would come from the jurors' careful evaluation of the facts, their interpretation of the law as instructed by the court, and whether the prosecution had met its burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That determination would ultimately shape the verdict and the future of everyone involved. As the trial entered its final phase, Both sides delivered closing arguments that distilled weeks of testimony into two competing narratives. The prosecution argued that the evidence, when viewed as a whole, failed to establish the legal elements required for self-defense. They urged jurors to rely on the complete timeline, forensic findings, witness testimony, and physical evidence presented throughout the trial. The defense, meanwhile, maintained that the defendant reasonably believed deadly force was necessary in the moment. Jurors were reminded that their task was not to speculate or respond to public opinion, but to determine whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt based solely on the evidence admitted in court. The judge then provided detailed legal instructions explaining how self-defense should be evaluated under the applicable law. Those instructions became the framework for every discussion inside the jury room. Each exhibit, witness statement, and forensic conclusion was measured against that legal standard. After deliberating, the jury returned with a verdict rejecting the self-defense claim. While individual jurors have not publicly disclosed every aspect of their deliberations, the verdict reflected their conclusion that the prosecution had met its burden under the law. If you're following this case and appreciate fact-based true crime coverage, please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Files, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue producing carefully researched documentaries focused on verified evidence rather than speculation. The verdict closed one chapter of the case, but for the families involved, its consequences were only beginning. Following the verdict, the courtroom shifted from determining guilt to addressing the legal consequences. During the sentencing phase, the court considered the evidence presented throughout the trial, the applicable sentencing laws, and any statements permitted under the proceedings. The judge's role was to impose a sentence consistent with the law rather than revisit the jury's factual findings. Legal analysts noted that the case had drawn extraordinary public attention, but the court repeatedly emphasized that media coverage and online debate could not influence the legal process. Every ruling, from evidentiary decisions to jury instructions, was grounded in established legal standards designed to ensure a fair trial. Even after the verdict, attorneys retained the right to pursue post-trial motions and appeals. Such filings are a routine part of the criminal justice system and do not automatically indicate that errors occurred during the trial. Appellate courts review specific legal issues rather than retrying the facts already decided by a jury. For the victims' loved ones, the proceedings marked the end of a long and emotionally exhausting legal battle. For the defendant's family, the outcome represented a different kind of hardship, one that would continue beyond the courtroom. Although the legal case had reached a significant milestone, its broader impact continued to ripple through the community. The tragedy remained a reminder of how a single encounter can leave lasting consequences, raising difficult questions about accountability, the boundaries of self-defense, and the responsibility carried by every decision made in moments of conflict. Long after the courtroom emptied, the emotional weight of the case remained. For the victim's family, the verdict could never erase the loss they had endured. In public statements made during and after the proceedings, they described the pain of losing a loved one and their hope that the legal process had provided a measure of accountability, even though no outcome could restore what had been taken from them. The defendant's family also faced a future forever changed. Throughout the case, they expressed support for their loved one and experienced the intense public scrutiny that accompanied the trial. The attention surrounding the case extended far beyond the courtroom, with online discussions often becoming deeply polarized. Within the community, the case sparked broader conversations about youth violence, conflict resolution, and the legal standards governing self-defense. Legal experts reminded the public that every self-defense claim depends on its specific facts and the evidence presented in court, making broad conclusions difficult and sometimes misleading. The jury's decision reflected its assessment of the evidence introduced during the trial, not the opinions circulating on social media or in news commentary. That distinction became one of the case's most important lessons. Public debate can shape perception, but only admissible evidence determines a criminal verdict. As media coverage gradually faded, the lasting impact remained with the families, friends, investigators, attorneys, and jurors who had lived through every stage of the case. For them, this was never simply another headline. It was a tragedy whose consequences would continue to be felt for years to come. In the end, this case became about far more than a single claim of self-defense. It demonstrated how criminal trials are ultimately decided, not by headlines, viral clips, or public opinion, but by evidence, witness credibility, forensic findings, and the law as explained by the court. After hearing weeks of testimony and reviewing the evidence presented, the jury reached a verdict that rejected the self-defense claim under the legal standard they were instructed to apply. Even so, the case continues to generate discussion. Some believe the verdict reflected a careful evaluation of the evidence, while others continue to question aspects of the investigation or trial. Those differing opinions remain part of the public conversation, but they are separate from the legal conclusions reached in court. Behind every exhibit and courtroom argument are real people whose lives were permanently altered. One family continues to grieve an unimaginable loss. Another faces the consequences of a conviction. No verdict can undo the events that brought them to that courtroom. Cases like this remind us that decisions made in a matter of seconds can shape countless lives forever. What do you think was the single most influential piece of evidence the jury considered when evaluating the self-defense claim? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. If you found this documentary informative, please like, share this video with others, subscribe to Cold Case Files, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next evidence-based true crime investigation. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next case.